Hey everyone, it's Samuel.
And I'm Matt.
And welcome to Plot Hooks, the podcast where we explore the arts of narrative and collaborative storytelling in the world's premier RPG, Dungeons & Dragons.
Today, in the Prime material, ways to introduce the main villain.
In the wilds, the shambling mound.
And in the Tavern, what would you do if the Shadowfell starts bleeding into the material plane?
Let's go. How's it going, Matt?
It's going good.
Good. Episode 4. Hard to believe.
Yeah, we made it.
Today, we made it to the end of the campaign. You know, no matter what campaign you're running, most every campaign culminates with a fight with a main villain. Whether it's the dastardly character that's behind everything, or the supremely powerful foe who's been conquering the land. Just about every campaign culminates with that sort of an event. But there are lots of ways as dungeon masters to incorporate a villain into our storytelling, into our campaigns. And today we're going to look at different ways that we can introduce different villains into our narratives. Before we do that, I want to go over some quick announcements. Reminder, follow us on all our social media. Check out us on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram. You can also check out our website via our podcast host, Buzzsprout, and support us on Patreon. There'll be some cool stuff coming down there soon. And also, as a reminder, if we hit 250 followers on Twitter, then a lucky follower is going to receive a D&D book of their choice. Whether you want to start your collection with the Monster Manual or the Dungeon Master's Guide, or you just want the latest Eberron source book, then follow us there, and you might win one of those books. But without further ado, the big bad. So yeah, Matt, there's lots of different ways to incorporate a villain into your campaign. We've both used variations of some of these in our various campaigns as dungeon masters. We're going to look at 7 today. What's the first one we're going to look at?
First one we're tackling is the impending doom, which is having the villain be a distant force that is coming, that is known about, and is exposed from the beginning of the arc, such as an invading army.
Yeah. Going to try to have an example from pop culture for each of these, just to kind of nail down exactly what we're talking about. The one that thought of for this one was Shan Yu and the invading Hun army in Mulan. You know, the whole premise of the movie starts with this invasion and the invading army and his general, with obviously the general being the utmost bad guy. And the whole plot is leading up to stopping this person. And so that's a way you could introduce your villain from the very beginning of the arc. Just have this villain be something that's coming at this future time, and it sort of creates a sense of dread and a good feeling of racing against the clock. I think that's one of the big pros of introducing a villain in this manner is it can really add a good amount of suspense to your narrative.
Yeah, it adds a kind of a bomb in the room that's going to go off.
Yeah.
There's an inherent tension with knowing that there is danger coming. One of the things that you have done in past campaigns is having events predetermined on the dates they're going to happen. So, you know, if you have an opposing army, it's going to invade this city on the 15th of March or whatever calendar you're using. And then keep track of the time, and regardless of what the protagonists are doing, whatever your players are doing, that army is going to reach the capital on the 15th of March, right? Yeah. That's a set in stone fact, and the story will work around that.
Yeah, and that's again part of this whole experience of Dungeons and Dragons as being collaborative storytelling. Your players' actions affect what happens on those days. If they get to them before if they get to the city before that city is attacked on the 10th of March, they get to help in its defense. If they don't, then they find out about it at a later date. It allows an opportunity for collaborative storytelling because they get to react, your PCs get to react how their characters would react to the overarching events that are happening in the world. And it can create a good sense of just realism because things are happening in the world. They're happening, okay, this city's invaded here, this event happened here, this event happened here, and it can really help add to the realism and just, again, this sense of impending doom of this threat coming down.
Honestly, I think this is probably the best choice, especially with people first starting out running games, is because it's very classic. Like I said, Disney uses it, Sean Yu in the movie Mulan. It makes the story move pretty quickly. People know where the threat is and where they're going. The downside is that normally you don't want to drag it out too long. It depends on the game you're running, but if you're planning to have a variety of adventures, you might have difficulty incorporating them into this because when you have a existential threat that's on its way, that's what the campaign is going to be about.
Yes, absolutely.
And so the PCs won't feel like they can do anything other than prepare or work against the threat. So that's something to keep in mind when you're building your campaign.
The second way to introduce your villain is what we call the Vanquisher. And that's revealing the villain extremely early in the campaign as a character that the PCs actually attack and or attacks the PCs and actually defeats them. An example of this would be Alduin in Skyrim and Elder Scrolls V, where it starts with you and Helgen being there on the chopping block about to perish, and all of a sudden this dragon attacks and destroys this city, and that just kicks off the whole narrative of the rest of the events of the game. The whole rest of the main quest line in that video game is getting to a point where you can re-encounter Alduin and destroy him, as you do in Sovngarde. And it can create a great story of redemption in your narrative, allow your player characters to have great character building moments as they're dealing with defeat, as they're dealing with interactions with each other, as they're going through various struggles in that regard. It can be a great story of them overcoming a terrible setback. It's one of the common ones that you see in things like video games, but it's not used as often in role-playing games because it does have some downsides.
Yeah, when it's done wrong, it can kind of break apart a party, and it can ruin trust between the DM and their group. And one of the things that makes this look really good on paper a lot of times, especially for newer DMs, that often goes wrong is they forget the investment that the players are going to have in the encounter, not knowing that they're not going to win.
Yeah.
This has happened to me a couple times in different games where I've been, as a player, given a situation and in some cases fought extremely long, grueling battles only to be defeated.
Yeah.
And then to realize afterwards, I never had a chance.
Yeah.
That just feels really bad as
Yes,
a player.
it does.
You feel like your evening or your time in the game was kind of wasted.
Yeah.
So if you're going to do this, you really want to do it quickly, or you want it to be exceedingly obvious that your players are not going to win.
Yeah.
One way you can do this is to introduce the threat as an extremely high-level monster.
Yeah.
Like a dragon, right? That if the players know what they're doing, know that this is not something they could actually beat.
Yeah.
And that point, it becomes about escaping or hiding and then getting powerful enough to fight it later.
Absolutely. And along that same vein, I would never recommend actually killing a PC in this type of encounter. It's one thing to lose a battle, but in a battle that is designed to be so difficult, having a PC actually die in that encounter is extremely destructive. And so this way of introducing your villain definitely has its spots, but it's definitely something you have to be very careful for.
And one last point on this: if you want to make clear how dangerous the villain is, this is a great time to twist the knife a little bit and kill an NPC that the party knows.
That's true.
That especially if it's one they have seen in action and know is powerful. That's also a good way to communicate the threat level. If you have an NPC who has been with the party for a decent amount of time, they know he's powerful, and he gets one-shotted by this thing with an ability that is they know is outside their weight class. Not only have you narratively given them a reason to hate this, to hate the enemy and to want to pursue it and destroy it, you have shown why they should not be engaging it yet.
Absolutely.
Another way to introduce your villain is what we're calling the Benedict, which is have the villain be an ally of the party who later exposes their true nature, perhaps with a betrayal.
Yeah, the example we came up with this one is Saruman in the Lord of the Rings, how in the Fellowship of the Ring, Gandalf is going to Saruman for advice and ends up stuck on top of Orthanc,
right.
And has to enlist some eagles to come help him out as Saruman begins to delve deeper and deeper into his desires to rule with Sauron and the Legion of the Two Towers. This can be an excellent twist, I think, to a story. Having an ally suddenly turn against the party, even sometimes if they're not even present, but just all of a sudden hearing that there's an ally that's actually turned against them is a great narrative twist. Some issues with it, though, is you have to make sure that you can connect the dots. You have to make sure that something like this makes sense. If it's done without good motivation, even if you're trying to hide the motivation, I would still recommend revealing some of the motivation to the party, because if there's not good motivation exposed for this NPC, it can feel hollow, just like as if it was a twist just for making a twist's sake. It was turning bad just for the simple sake of, ooh, I wanted to create this cool encounter, so I'm just going to turn this guy you like and turn him into a villain. You have to make sure that you've seeded little things really subtly, not subtly enough where you actually want them to pick up on the seeds. If they do, great. Maybe that'll change your story and go in a different direction. It is collaborative storytelling, after all, but just little things that in the aftermath they can then pick up on and actually realize what was going on behind the scenes. That can do it in a fulfilling way and not in a way that's going to make your party upset.
Yeah, there's also another way you can kind of play with this idea of betrayal. And going back to Saruman, it's interesting because when we never meet Saruman in the book as anything other than a villain. But he still has this effect of being someone who in universe is greatly trusted as this authority, as this wise person, who is then revealed to be evil pretty early on. So another alternative way of running this would be, say, have the PCs learn about, let's just rip it straight from Tolkien, a powerful wizard who can help them. Yeah. And then they go to find the powerful wizard. And at first, and this is within the space of a single session, right? Yeah. Like between meeting him at the start of a session and the end, it becomes quickly apparent that what they thought would be an ally is an enemy, and then they're trapped or something like that. Yeah. So you don't have to, it's great if you can plant seeds and cause a betrayal and a twist. That's true. The twist can be much subtler or much shorter in span of time. Yeah. Where it's a kind of a bait and switch instead of a long planned betrayal.
Yeah. No, that's an excellent point. The fourth way of introducing a big bad is the clandestined. This is having the villain's schemes be noticeable, but have the villain's identity be completely shrouded in mystery as the party is investigating it. This is like basically any crime show ever. It is there's these crimes that are occurring. These fires are happening. These murders are happening. We're trying to figure it out. Is like an episode of Criminal Minds. We're looking at all the clues. We're seeing what evidence we can gather. We have no idea who's doing this, but we know that something's going wrong, and we can slowly put together the pieces and actually eventually figure out exactly who is behind the whole scheme. Martin Wagner from The Girl with a Dragon Tattoo is another good example of this. And this could be a really satisfying narrative, again, if it's done right, because all the work that the PCs put into of following these clues, of doing these puzzles, can pay off. But just like any of the others, it's also got downsides.
Right. It really can't be satisfying, but one of the ways that it can go wrong is if a party is always looking for someone and they are constantly met with dead ends.
Yeah.
That can get very frustrating.
Absolutely.
And I think as a DM, it's something you have to decide, one, how long your party will tolerate meeting dead ends. And then maybe even how far you're willing to push them to get the satisfaction of the reveal.
Yeah.
Right? Because sometimes you might have to put up with your party being like, we can't find this guy for maybe a session or so. So the next session you can have the reveal, but that's a dangerous line to walk of irritating your players too much.
Yeah.
So it's something to be very careful with, but it can be really, it can be great, and if that's the sort of story you're trying to tell.
Yeah, I think with this particular version, I would, as a DM, prepare multiple side plots and side narratives that can be going on at the same time. Things that if they do miss a clue or meet a dead end, they can then delve into something else and delve into another part of an arc for a split second before you have an event come around which brings them back to the primary narrative. That way they're not feeling like they're constantly in this search and they're constantly failing because they're not finding the guy. If you have those things planned, it can alleviate some of the tension there, which is inherent in trying to tell a mystery story in that way and trying to play that type of narrative.
Definitely. You definitely want to have missions and goals for your party that they can accomplish so that they are making progress somewhere and it's not just dead ends.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Another way to introduce your villain is what we're terming the unexpected. This is similar to the Benedict, but in this case, it's having the villain pose as an innocent-looking NPC, such as a barkeep, a shopkeeper, a politician, or the like. Someone who the party interacts with occasionally, but turns out to be behind it all. An example of this is Palpatine from the prequel trilogy of Star Wars, and especially in the first two movies.
Yeah. If somebody just watches like the Phantom Menace and just sees Palpatine, they have no idea who he's actually going to turn into.
Right.
But yeah, that's a great example of the unexpected. I think this works really, really good for local villains. Villains who could be like crime lords or something in a local town, and perhaps the PCs in your narrative have been tasked by the leader of a certain settlement with rooting out the corruption or with dealing with some sort of effect, and it turns out that the local potion seller has an illegal drug ring in her basement, or something like that, where there's some sort of person that is not affiliated, not an ally, like with the Benedict, with the party, but someone that they are very aware of, who all of a sudden turns out to have this other motive.
Well, and I think two things to be kind of to point out would be you actually just did it pretty well, distinguishing the unexpected from the Benedict, where this shouldn't feel like a betrayal so much as a reveal.
Yeah.
Right? Like when you find out It's like, oh, the cabbage merchant was evil the whole time, right? It's like, oh, that wasn't a
my cabbages,
right? Finally, his revenge. But that's not a betrayal. It's a reveal of, oh, this is what this person was actually doing. It's not supposed to be a stab in the heart of your party.
Yeah,
and I think that should be the thing. It shouldn't emotionally affect your party the same way as the Benedict should.
Yeah, absolutely.
One of the pitfalls this can be is that you can't make the reveal too ridiculous. Now, there's ways you can always... skilled enough storytellers can make almost anything work. But your cobbler should not be revealed to be the ancient lich from beyond time and space, right? Now, on one hand, that could actually be a really interesting story. I don't think I could pull it off, right? Without my table just like laughing at me for being like, wait, this guy is this great evil? So it's something that you have to... you have to make sure that the reveal is going to fit with the role. Your example of a local potion keeper who, turns out she's got a drug ring in her basement. That's a perfect level of local person to local crime. Palpatine is a senator in the Galactic Senate.
Yeah.
So him eventually being revealed as a Sith who's trying to usurp power is, again, it fits the scale.
Yeah, absolutely. The sixth one that we wanted to look at is the backstory reveal, drawing the villain from a figure in a player character's backstory. Somebody like the Red Hood from Batman, who, of course, for those of you who aren't familiar, was Jason Todd, the second Robin, who had been killed by the Joker and then was resurrected by being dunked in a Lazarus pit and came back, and Batman was fighting him, and Batman did not know who it was for a while, and it turned out to be a character from his backstory. And this was one that you've used a lot in actually a non-D&D role-playing game. Yeah,
this was actually using player backstory to create villains was kind of the main thrust behind a long-running Star Wars game that I ran. The main upside for this is that the player connected to that villain via the backstory is going to, if they're invested in their character at all, is going to get invested in the fight with them, right? So I had like a Wookiee in a game whose villain was Imperial who formerly enslaved him. And so when that guy showed up, obviously that player is like, great, we're going after him, we've got a plan, you know?
Yeah.
And I had similar connections with all the other characters. So the upside is that it's very easy to get invested.
Yeah.
The downside is that it can become very focused on individual characters.
Yeah.
And the way this campaign ended up breaking down was that we would have several sessions kind of dedicated to focusing on each character's backstory, basically, which worked really well and people enjoyed it. But the downside was that during those sessions, it really became about the backstory of that character.
Yeah.
There were ways we were able to bridge other backstories into it, but that person very much became the protagonist of that narrative.
Yeah.
So if you do use this, you need to be aware of how the shift of focus is going to affect the table.
Yeah.
And again, there's nothing wrong with it. I mean, my players loved that campaign. It lasted for like 2.5 years or so. But there was an understanding at the table that it was okay that it wasn't about the whole party for us that session. It was about the individual character, and the rest were okay playing supporting actors.
Yeah. This becomes easier the longer that a party has been together, because what it does provide is it provides a great opportunity for the players to come together and rally behind that particular player character. Think specifically of Critical Role and the story of Trent Ickathon and Liam O'Brien's character Caleb. It was in episode 80-something that he came across Trent Ickathon again. But there had been so much time spent and investment made between Caleb and the other members of his party that whenever he came across this person, it was a real building moment, because literally they came across this person and all of his friends gathered around and stood between him and this NPC, and it was just a wonderful moment, and it can be a great rallying point around a player, and it can provide great opportunities to tell stories about relationships being built, about walls being broken down, about healing from past trauma. It can be an excellent opportunity for stories, but if you do it too early, then your other characters don't feel like they've had the opportunity to really build out their character or build out a relationship with this character. They don't care about this person from this person's background yet because they don't care about that person yet.
Right.
And there has to be some build up to it. But once there is, I think it can provide a great opportunity for growth of the party through the obstacle from a person's past showing back up.
Yeah, definitely.
The final one that we wanted to look at was the Mastermind. This is the classic. This is the mustache twirler. This is the villain who plays so far behind the scenes that the party doesn't even realize everything that's going on connects together until it's too late. This is like Ernst Stavro Blofeld in the movie Spectre, the 2015 James Bond movie. And this can be a really satisfying reveal, especially at the end of a really long campaign. Not to say that literally everything has to connect, but connecting a lot of dots together, it makes a really satisfying reveal. But by all means, we have to plan ahead as DMs if this is part of our narrative. This is not something that we can just come up with as the campaign's coming to an end. Okay, how do I make this a satisfying ending? If we try to do the mastermind villain, then we won't be able to pull all the threads together and actually make it make sense. It will be loose. It will feel like it was just sprung on the party, and it won't be a satisfying ending because it won't make complete sense that all those threads connect unless you've been planning on it and trying to hint that they all do, and then it can be seen in hindsight. But if we don't do that, then I think it's very unsatisfying.
Yeah, narratively speaking, having a character step out from behind a curtain and say, "It was me the whole time," is either gonna like floor your table or it's going to infuriate them. There's really, in my mind, there's no in between. It's a difficult move to pull off.
Yes, it is.
Like Sam was saying, it can be very hard to do this at the last minute. I actually have an example where I did have to do this at the last minute in a game once, where due to various reasons a campaign was ending a bit early and I had a bunch of plot threads left.
Yeah.
And I had been building a plot with a character who I was eventually going to have betray the party. But I didn't have the time to flesh him out.
Yeah.
So I grabbed a character from one person's backstory to be the final villain and kind of welded this traitor onto ending up working for him, which was never the plan, so I could have the betrayal scene because I had been subtly building up to it and my game players knew this was probably going to happen. So I had to narratively do that. But it was real shoddy work in terms of narrative. Like, it worked, and we got a couple cool scenes out of it, and my party liked it. But I knew that I had not really set it up. So one thing you really don't want to do is use the mastermind as a last-ditch effort to create a final villain.
Yeah.
Right? Like, if your party does something that throws your plans off, to have a character step out of nowhere and be, "It was actually me," is probably not what you should do, because it will feel like it's out of left field and it won't work.
Yeah. Well, with that being said, with those 7 out of the way, want to head on to the wilds?
Let's get to the wilds.
Well, we're back in the wilds.
Here we are.
To look at some dirt. some rotting vegetation.
See that dirt? Look at it.
Well, thanks for joining us here at the Now it's time to go to the tavern. All right. Now, the shambling mound, or it's sometimes called the shambler, is basically just a rotting group of vegetation that is sentient.
Also has teeth.
Yes, it has teeth. Yes, it's the monster manual says it can form up into the size of about a medium humanoid, but its quote unquote head is just really just a mouth. It's been around since first edition and the original 1977 monster manual, but I love this monster because of just the way that it works. It provides such great storytelling opportunities. First off, it's started by either lightning or magic from the Feywild kind of brings an ordinary swamp plant to life. And this flora kind of gets just reborn and it begins to just gather up energy from all the flora and fauna around it and slowly begins forming into this sentient ball of roots and swampiness, and then slowly begins to take up other things and then unroots itself and begins walking around the swamp as this sentient shambling mound.
So it's Frankenstein's swamp monster.
Yes, that's a perfect description. But that central portion of it is actually the being itself. Everything else is just the rotting vegetation, the rotting remnants of the humanoid is devoured. All that sort of stuff that's connected to it is the body of it. That central, what the Monster Manual calls the root stem, is the actual source of the creature. And there's a few different reasons why I like this. For one, it's an interesting combat encounter because it can actually swallow your PCs and make some interesting encounters with I love beasts that can swallow various creatures. It just makes for a very interesting encounter whenever all of a sudden the party has to deal with one of their members being taken off the board. It really adds to the story a little bit.
Well, it's also a great opener. It mentions that they are I don't know stat-wise how good they are at this, but it mentions that they are unseen hunters and that they ambush prey. So if you have a party walking through a forest, to suddenly, while walking, have one party member get engulfed, that starts the combat off in a really tense position where one guy's inside trying to fight his way out and the others are outside trying to figure out what just happened.
Yeah, it is. That's another reason I like it, is it's an excellent ambush monster. If you read through their stat block, or not even their stat block, but just their information in the monster manual, they're a great suspenseful monster at lower levels. Because as they're building that plant, before it can actually walk around on its own, it's beginning to choke the life out of the plants around it. Once it begins moving around, it's moving around devouring all the plants as it goes. It's not just looking for humanoids, it's devouring all the plant lives. It is leeching all of the life essence from all the area around it and turning it into eventually a desolate wasteland just because of this thing's hunger. And so you can have a party enter this area and suddenly come across just this path through the woods that's just filled with sludge and lack of flora and fauna, and they don't know what this is, and you can just have whole areas be consumed with several of these, and your players have to actually investigate what happened, what's causing this, until they eventually actually encounter this being. And once they do, one interesting thing about them is, again, since that little root ball inside of it is the actual entity itself, it can fake its own death. If it knows that it's going to lose, then it can just drop all the the stuff it's accumulated around it and just kind of play possum. And if that central node is not destroyed, then whenever it's safe, it can just slither that vegetation back up and go right back on its merry way, and it can become a recurrent threat where they're like, oh, I thought we fixed, like, this rainforest was fine, and after we did that, but it didn't recover, something's still wrong, and it could just become an interesting thing, especially at lower levels, as this is a CR5 monster that is a challenging enough encounter for a low level party, and also provides just some good role-playing opportunities as they're just trying to figure out what's going on.
Yeah, I think especially this is a great, I would say, if you want to introduce a group to D&D, this is a fantastic antagonist to have for your first couple of sessions.
Yeah.
Because, if you stretch it out, you could have a session of them investigating a town where someone's gone missing, and people and livestock are going missing, and they go out into the woods and investigate, and they can have minor encounters along the way. And so by the time they reach him, they're leveled up to level 4 or so, where it's going to be a tough fight, but they could probably do it if there's enough of them. And then you've got this great investigation story and a very obvious threat with lots of interesting details about it. So you're not just fighting kobolds in a cave, or goblins in a meadow or whatever. You're fighting something really kind of weird and strange and horrifying. I think this is a great monster for the beginning of a PC's career.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, that's the Shambling Mound. Are you ready to head back to the tavern?
Let's get away from the Shambling Mound and head to the tavern.
Sounds like a plan. All right, back here in the tavern.
Yep, still shaking some leaves out of my boots, but...
Well, I don't think it's going to get any less gloomy, not judging by what you said earlier in the introduction.
Yeah, today in the tavern, we're discussing this plot hook. What would you do if the Shadowfell was bleeding through into the material plane?
Yeah, that sounds like an unadvisable situation to remain in, if one could help it.
Now, should we briefly describe what the Shadowfell is for people who might not know?
Absolutely. So the prime material plane, as we discussed actually 2 episodes ago, whenever we went over the upper planes, or 2 of the upper planes rather, the Shadowfell is like a reflection of the prime material plane. It's also called the plane of shadow. It's a dark, colorless, gray, despair-filled place which essentially encapsulates all that is gloomy. It overlaps the material plane. The landmarks are roughly similar, but whereas you might have a wondrous mountain in the prime material plane, or a glorious, vibrant castle in that same location in the Feywild, in the Shadowfell, you've got a disgusting, huge, gnarled, evil tree in the place of this thing. So the topography and everything's kind of the same, but it's worse in the Shadowfell. And then there are things that...
Same but worse.
Yes, exactly. Hey, same but worse. The Fey is same but crazier. The
Shadowfell is
same but worse. But there are these things called shadow crossings. Since the planes do overlap, essentially, since it is a reflection of the prime material plane, shadow crossings are places where the membrane between the planes are so thin that it's possible to go between the Shadowfell and the prime material. And this takes place at areas which are dark, which are gloomy. Things like tombs and graveyards and swamps and places which we typically would more so associate with something like the Shadowfell. There can be these little areas where you can cross through between the two. But our question today is, what happens if the Shadowfell is in a place that is bleeding through? Perhaps there's something extra gloomy happening around this town, or around this area where the player characters are at. And the despair of the Shadowfell actually begins to bleed through into the prime material play.
Yeah, my first thought with this is that it's a good way to take a traditional D&D adventure and make it a lot more interesting.
Yeah.
So your players could easily come across a kind of gloomy town, and you describe it as such. But then they start realizing how full of despair the people in the town are, and that leads to a nice mystery. What's going on? Maybe there's disappearances, maybe things are happening. In my mind, one of the aspects about the Shadowfell is that there's a lot of undead there.
Yes.
So one way you could do this is if you want to have kind of a standard, D&D, let's go fight some skeletons sort of adventure, you totally can. You can make it more interesting if the undead are coming through the Shadowfell, and that's a mystery for your players to discover. But you mentioned something about the despair of the Shadowfell affecting players?
Yeah, in the Dungeon Master's Guide, when it discusses the Shadowfell, there's the optional rule, as all the other planes have, which affects PCs at the DM's discretion whenever they're traveling in the Shadowfell. But it could be that in your particular setting, depending on the story that you're trying to tell, you could actually have that Shadowfell despair rule actually come into effect more and more the closer they actually get to the source of whatever is going on. And this could actually even be a good introduction to the Shadowfell if you were doing even something like if you wanted to go to Ravenloft, if you wanted to do something like an adventure, and you wanted to eventually work the Curse of Strahd into your campaign. You could kind of use this as an introduction to the Shadowfell in that way.
Well, I was even going to say that there are two notes here. One is that this is also a great way, thinking about how mechanics connect the narrative, is you're going to have, if you apply these optional rules, even in like a lighter version that gets progressively worse as they get closer to the source, your players are going to know, oh, there's an adventure here. Because they walk into this town that seems kind of gloomy. They're like, okay, whatever, maybe they stay in for the night. And when they go to bed, you say, okay, everybody roll. And then a few players start feeling low. And all of a sudden, the players are going to know, wait a minute, there's an adventure in this town. This isn't normal. But the other way, this is a great way to connect. Heck, I think the way the Curse of Strahd campaign starts is your party wandering in a mist and coming out into the place in the Shadowfell where Strahd's castle or whatever is. And so this could, depending on how this game goes, maybe they fall into the Shadowfell at the end. Or even if they don't, you've given them an introduction to the concept.
Yeah.
And a very easy tie-in to running a pre-published campaign.
Yeah. Those are great ideas. Well, I think that just might about do it for episode 4 of Plot Hooks. I want to say, again, thank you all for listening from all of us here on the team. Thanks to Matt for co-hosting today. Good to have you back after missing you last week.
Yeah, it's good to be back.
And thanks again from me, Samuel, and from Zach and Dave and Mike and Steve and Becca and Ellie, the podcast pupper. Can't forget about her. We will see you all next week.